We've been reading since we were little kids.
But as young adults, scrolling is just so addictive. Before you know it, there's no time to read anymore.
So, why is reading valuable? Why does it matter?
I don't know about you, but scrolling tends to leave me feeling hollow and empty, whereas books can hold something deeper.
There are so many things we can learn about how society works by observing how they play out in fiction.
And so we want to read more and use our skills as English majors to show how our world is reflected in the pages of our favourite books.
Hi, I'm Ashley, and I'm a writer. I strongly believe that there's no such thing as having too many books.
I'm Caitlin. I'm a mathematician, but I love English and I love analysing the ideas in books.
So come with us as we wander through the realm of stories and discover their meaning in our world.
Welcome to our very first episode of The Literary Lamppost. I'm Caitlin.
And I'm Ashley.
Today we are going to be starting off with a very well-known and very well-loved classic, Anne of Green Gables. I feel like this is a book that a lot of people know of or have interacted with somewhat, but maybe they haven't read it for a really long time or they've only ever seen the series, but we're going to talk about it. So Ashley, why are we talking about this book?
Well, Anne of Green Gables has been beloved by many generations of people. It was written in 1908 by Lucy Maud Montgomery, over 100 years ago, yet I feel like it's still so relevant. There has to be a reason why books written so long ago are still read today, still talked about, still so loved. And Anne of Green Gables is one of those books, and we want to look into some of those reasons why it's still so relevant.
So I'm going to try my very best to give a quick spoiler-free summary of this book for those of you who have maybe not read it yet. This book is set in Prince Edward Island in Canada in a small town called Avonlea, and it's actually based on Lucy Maud Montgomery's childhood home. It's a very small farming town. It's got a one-room schoolhouse and a church that the whole town goes to, and not all that much else. The story begins with Matthew and Marilla Cuthbert, who are an older brother and sister. They've never married, they are still living together, and they decide to adopt a boy to help them with their work on the farm. Well, surprise, surprise, when Matthew goes to pick up said boy from the train station, he's greeted by, instead of a boy, a girl. Her name is Anne Shirley.
And spelled with an E.
And she has a really huge imagination, a really unique way of seeing things, and just a lot of joy in her. And this girl with her red hair and her chatterbox personality is so much more than they could ever expect. Originally, they are not sure if they're going to keep her or send her back to the orphanage. They ultimately do decide to keep her, and she becomes like a daughter to them. And the story is a coming-of-age story about Anne, how she integrates into their little society. She becomes best friends with the girl who lives next door. Her name is Diana. And that's where the term kindred spirits comes from, and refers to Diana as a kindred spirit and a bosom friend. She starts school. As Anne grows up, she learns how to be a lady. She learns how to tame her wild imagination and become a really beautiful young woman. That's a bit of a summary of the story. So let's get into some of the main themes and takeaways that we love about this story.
Well, first of all, we can't talk about this without talking about her imagination. She dreams up stories and different names for herself, names for the world around her. There's this one road, which everybody calls the Avenue. But when Anne first sees it, she decides that it has to be called the White Way of Delight because of all the flowering trees. And another one, which everybody calls Barry's Pond, she names the Lake of Shining Waters. And she's got this beautiful imagination, and she's got such a curiosity about the world. And I feel like that curiosity is often lost, maybe on our generation, but also as we grow up, we kind of lose that imagination. Though Diana does complain throughout the book that she doesn't have an imagination like Anne, and there is one point where Anne tells her that imaginations need cultivating, and it takes practice to be able to find the joy in the little things in life.
Yeah, I think that maybe finding joy in little things in life, it does require some imagination. I don't think we need quite as much as Anne's.
No, maybe not.
Because my imagination is so much less than Anne's. I feel like you have more of an imagination than I do, Ashley. But I have to say, after finishing this book, it's really encouraged me to take joy in the little things. So I've got a rose that's blooming on my balcony at the moment, and it just makes me so happy when I stop to think about it, to stop and smell the roses, I guess. But
Anne would be naming that rose.
Yeah,
Are you going to name yours?
No, I'm not going to
You should
name...
name your rose.
I'm not going to name my rose, but since finishing Anne of Green Gables, I've just started to look at the things around me and stop to enjoy them a little bit more. And something that stuck out to me specifically was when they were driving back from the train station, Anne was in wonder about all of these things like the White Way of Delight and the Lake of Shining Waters. Everything that she sees is a thing of beauty and a marvel. And I can't remember the last time I went on a drive and I felt that way.
Well, listen, I've got a couple of quotes here. I think they're beautiful, and maybe it'll give you a little bit more of an idea of how she thinks. She says, "Isn't it splendid to think of all the things there are to find out about? It just makes me feel glad to be alive. It's such an interesting world. It wouldn't be half so interesting if we knew all about everything, would it?" Imagine having that sort of mindset. I don't most of the time. She also says, "All sorts of mornings are interesting, don't you think? You don't know what's going to happen through the day, and there's so much scope for imagination."
That's one of her favourite quotes, isn't it?
Yes,
Scope for imagination.
She just lives in a constant state of wonder about the world around her. And maybe it's not completely realistic, but we can learn from her attitude. What do you think it would look like if we had that sort of delight for life, if we cultivated it? We're so focused on the end goal, on making it, for example. Anne has ambition, especially further on in the book, but she's also thrilled about the journey itself.
Journey before destination.
Yeah, I know that's cliche, but it's true.
Yeah, I remember reading a little piece a little while ago about how nowadays, because we have an app for everything, we can look up anything, we don't have that time to wonder about things. Like, we see a bird and we don't wonder about it. We just immediately, if we want to know what it is, we just Google it and find out what it is. But I feel like we've actually lost a fair bit of that wonder about the world around us. But I don't think that it's impossible to recapture.
Yeah, definitely not. Something Anne is always going on about is romance. You know, she wants everything to be romantic. Everything is romantic for her. And I actually went and looked up the definition of romance, because nowadays it's only associated with love. But there's actually a second definition, and I'll read it. It's a quality or feeling of mystery, excitement, and remoteness from everyday life. It's hard because we live in a world where we have so much at the tips of our fingers. You pull up your phone and instantly you can find out what's happening on the other side of the world. And a lot of it's terrible news, and it's hard to step back from that and look at the little things in your life, the small, maybe simple things, and finding a childlike joy in them. And yes, of course, we can be ambitious and look at the big picture, but I think it's important to realize that everyday life is made up of those little things. Like when you get home from work and you step out onto your balcony and you see that your rose has bloomed, that can bring you joy.
Yeah, and I feel like a lot of the time we actually forget that those things are important. Anne does that really, really well, and that was a big takeaway for me from reading Anne of Green Gables.
One thing though, she can't imagine away her red hair. A constant source of grievance for her. She thought that her red hair was ugly. And that's interesting because nowadays people are dyeing their hair red and putting on fake freckles. It's just interesting how beauty standards have changed. But yeah, that's another thing that we wanted to talk about in Anne of Green Gables. It's this idea of beauty and acceptance of self. Throughout this entire book, people are constantly commenting on the way that Anne looks. She says at one point, and I think it's really sad, she says that she'd rather be pretty than clever, she says. She's constantly being twitted about her looks, but then she gets told off for thinking about them.
It's true.
Marilla didn't want to compliment her even, because she said it would make her more vain. So I actually want to talk about vanity. It's not really a word that we use anymore. The official definition is being proud and conceited about the way that you look, but often in books, especially classics, it's written in the sense that vanity is caring at all about the way that you look, even like moaning about how you look. And there's one point in the story where she dyes her hair, or she tries. She really tries. But instead of turning black, it turns green. And she has to cut all her hair off. And she decides that with her short hair, she's ugly and she's going to do penance to look at herself in the mirror, determined to devote all her energies to being good and never caring about being beautiful. By the end, she's, I think, 16 and a half, and she's able to laugh at herself for caring so much about her hair and her freckles. And you can see how much she's grown to be able to accept who she is.
So for those who don't know, Anne with an E is the more recent adaptation of Anne of Green Gables. It came out relatively recently. What do we think about Anne with an E?
Look, my heart will always be with the Megan Follows movies.
It's a bit contentious for some people because it does deviate from the story a fair bit.
Well, it discusses issues that
would have been present at the time, but they weren't discussed in the book. And I think it actually makes for a really interesting conversation. But specifically, there's a quote that you really like from that, yeah?
I love this quote. This is in season 3. Anne's friends are hosting a party for her 16th birthday, and they're talking about boys. And Anne says in true Anne form, "I plan only to be the bride of adventure." And a good friend of Anne says, "I never know what you're talking about." And Anne responds saying, "I am a conscientious objector of the status quo."
That's such a good quote.
I really like that because, well, a conscientious objector, the phrase is originally used for someone who doesn't want to go into the army because maybe of their religious beliefs or
their moral values.
Yeah, and the status quo is
just keeping things the way they are.
So Anne rejects that, and she's older by this time, and she's able to see that she is an individual. She's maybe a little bit different. Maybe she doesn't look like everybody else or necessarily act like everybody else, but she's okay with that. She's embraced who she is, and she's learning to love who she is. And I think that's an important takeaway, to value other things about ourselves, not just how we look, not just our beauty. And as girls, that's hard.
Because there's so many influences around us telling us how we need to be, what we need to do, what we should look like, how we should live our lives.
And yet there are things that are so much more important than beauty, like intelligence, ambition, friendship, compassion. Are you a kind person?
I really love the quote, "the conscientious objector to the status quo." And that's not actually in the original book, but it is an extension of Anne's personality. And we see that throughout the book where she challenges the way that things are. So we mentioned before Rachel Lynde, she's the neighbour of Matthew and Marilla. She has some very strong opinions. It's pretty clearly stated towards the beginning of the book that she is pro-women's suffrage. She wants women to have the right to vote, and she's on that side of politics. However, there's a couple comments through the book where she objects to a female teacher coming into the school to replace the male teacher, and she objects to the idea of having female ministers. And to both of these things, Anne just has the response of, "I think a woman would make an amazing teacher. I think a woman would make an amazing minister." And this is, set 100 years ago when women didn't even have the right to vote in Canada yet. And yet we have Anne talking about how splendid it would be for a woman to be a minister. We have this idea that gender roles were really set back then, and there's quite a few voices on the internet these days saying, yeah, we should go back to how things were, where women were quiet and submissive and in the house and didn't have opinions and didn't say things, and men should be the protectors and the providers and make all the decisions and whatnot. And yet when we rewind the clock 100 years, we see that, yes, sure, there might have been more traditional roles per se. So for example, Matthew Cuthbert works the farm, he does all the outdoor chores, he works in the barn, he works with the horses, all of that, and Marilla shells peas and does the sewing and all of that. But Marilla actually has the final say on a lot of things in their household, and the final say on how to raise Anne, and a lot of other things. Both of them were essentially in the home working, just Matthew was out in the field and Marilla was in the household. And some of these voices on the internet claiming that we should go back to these, they really don't have a good understanding of the way that life worked back then and the way that society was set up in order to facilitate these different roles. And Marilla is actually the kind of more headstrong, strong personality, where Matthew is a softer, more sensitive person.
He's basically the fashionista of the whole story. He's the one who first notices that Anne looks different from the other girls and then realizes it's because of her lack of puffed sleeves and bright colors in her dresses, and he goes and sorts out a dress for her to be made, and from then on Anne has fashionable dresses because Matthew made sure of it.
Yeah, and that kind of just opens up this discussion of what quote-unquote traditional masculinity actually looks like. Rewinding the clock 100 years, and we have this example of a man who is really sensitive to needs of his adopted daughter's heart and wanting her to have beautiful things and wanting her to fit in. He's just such a kind person, and I think kindness goes so much further than a lot of the alpha stuff that we see these days. Another really good example of this is Gilbert Blythe.
Oh, we love Gilbert.
So how do we first meet Gilbert in this book?
Well, Anne's been going to school for a couple of weeks already, and Gilbert's been away, and he comes to school for the first time and sees the new girl. He wants to get her attention, except she's ignoring him. So finally, he decides to play on her worst insecurity. So he grabs her by the braid and whispers, "Carrots! Carrots!" And, you know, fiery red temper to go along with her fiery red hair. She stands up, smashes a slate over his head, and declares that she is never going to speak to him again.
I really love Gilbert's response to this, because that's the last time he ever teases her or does anything mean to her. He realizes just how much he's upset her, and essentially the rest of the book is him trying to make amends.
Yeah, and her being mean to him.
So when she is forced to sit next to him as a punishment, he slides her a little candy heart that has "You're sweet" written on it.
Which she grinds under her heel.
He leaves a bright red apple on her desk as a gift. He just keeps making these really kind, sweet gestures to try to make up for hurting her feelings. Even going so far as rescuing her when she gets herself stuck in the middle of a river.
And still she wouldn't forgive him. But she did regret it for the rest of the book.
And I just really love this soft, loving, kind version of masculinity that is embodied in Gilbert Blythe. Today, I feel like so much of the discourse around masculinity is about being tough and being alpha, and that might appeal to a certain type of woman, but I think Gilbert is a girlhood sweetheart for a reason. There are very few girls that I've come across that don't like Gilbert Blythe.
Most girls would prefer a Gilbert Blythe over an alpha male.
And you know, Gilbert Blythe's friendship or rivalry with Anne really pushes her to succeed in school. And it's a big motivator for her academic success for a long time and a really big part of her sense of belonging in Avonlea. And I think that That sense of belonging is something that was really, really important to Anne. One of the first things that she says to Matthew when he first picks her up at the train station is, "Oh, it seems so wonderful that I'm going to live with you and belong to you. I've never belonged to anybody, not really." And that comes up again when she says that she's never really had a real home before or a real family. And it just seems to me to highlight the importance of family. And the family that Anne creates with Matthew and Marilla, it's not a traditional family. It's a brother and sister and an adopted daughter. And yet it is so important. It is so much a real family. And it means so much to Anne, and it is so important for her growing up to have that sense of family. I think that we were created to have a family and to have people around us. And I think it's really important that even if a family's not completely traditional, we don't judge people for the way that they choose to create families.
And it's not just family, it's also the friends that Anne surrounded herself with, and the friends that we surround ourselves with also have an impact on our belonging.
In our culture, there's so much emphasis put on a romantic relationship, that's what we should strive for, that's the most important relationship in our life. And yet for most of the book, not until the very end does Anne even have a hint of romance. For the most of the book, the most important peer relationship she has is with her best friend Diana.
She longs for what she calls a kindred spirit, someone, she says, to whom I can confide my inmost soul. And she does find that in Diana. Growing up before that, she only ever had imaginary friends. She would talk to an echo in the forest or her reflection in the glass.
And then after finding Diana, she's able to have that real life, deep, meaningful friendship that is so formational to who she is and who she becomes.
Yeah, so I feel like a kindred spirit is someone who understands you, someone with whom around you can be completely yourself, who loves you for you and doesn't want to change you. And I feel like it's hard to find people like that, especially as an adult. In school it's easier because you see people every day and it's easy to hang out with your friends. But as an adult, it's harder to find people who can be kindred spirits, and you're busy, you plan to have coffee maybe once every 2 months and then you have to cancel because something's come up. You have long distance friends. It's not so easy, but I think it's important in a world that is actually very disconnected, even though we may seem very connected because of the internet. I think it's important to prioritize connection and relationships. And I really love this one quote that Anne says. She says, "Kindred spirits are not so scarce as I used to think. It's splendid to find out there are so many of them in the world." And it might take more work for us, those of us not growing up in Avonlea, but finding those people, holding tight to them, should be a priority.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I have a few people in my life who have been in my life since I was a child, and they are still really important to me. Some of them I would consider kindred spirits. Even though I'm in another country, even though I don't get to see them very often, they're still such important parts of who I became, and that's just really valuable.
My kindred spirit has the audacity to move to England. Maybe we have shown a little bit about why Anne of Green Gables is relevant today, why it has stayed relevant for over 100 years, because these themes that we're talking about are continuous.
They're very human and they're consistent across so many different generations, regardless of the changes in technology, regardless of the life that we live, where we live, what we do. This need for human connection and this need for family and taking joy in the everyday little things in life. That's something that we can all take into our life.
Yeah, definitely. So, thank you for joining us on our very first episode of the Literary Lamppost podcast. Make sure to follow us on Instagram at the Literary Lamppost and subscribe so you can get our updated episodes. See you next time.